My name is Dr. Erin-Marie Legacey, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of History. And I teach a class called From Vampires to Death Tourism, the Dead in Europe Since 1700. This is a class I developed. It's based around my research interests, and I've taught it at a couple of other schools, but I'm really excited to bring it here to Tech. That wasn't the title originally. The title originally was just The Dead in Europe Since 1700, but it was suggested that maybe I should add vampires to it since that was in the content of the class. So basically, those two themes bookend the class. So we start in sort of a pre-industrial Europe, and then we end in the 21st century. And so the first thing that students look at in the class is this folklore and mythology of vampires, and the last thing we look at is this phenomenon of death tourism, primarily in the post-war period in Europe. This idea of visiting sites of devastation and loss and death as a kind of commercial venture and as like a tourist activity. My research is about the way that people use the dead to try to process bigger changes that are happening in society, and that's really what the class is about. It's not about attitudes about death, it's not about how people are thinking about the process of dying or death. It's really about how humans use the dead to work through bigger changes that are happening around them. And my research specifically is about the French Revolution and cemeteries, the Paris catacombs, these things that are invented in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, and how this is a way for Parisians to try to come to terms with some of the biggest changes that they've seen taking place over the course of their lives. Even though the class starts in 1700, we proceed very quickly through the early modern period. We spend a lot of time in the 19th century. I think we get to the 21st century. In the past, I've had students look at this phenomena called plastination, which is the process of turning corpses into kind of a plastic-like substance that are then put on display for like a visiting paying public. And so I think that was 21st century. A lot of the readings end up leading to discussions almost about sort of the ethics of these practices, which isn't really the point of the class, but the discussions lead to interesting places, I suppose. So the folklore of the vampire is really more specific to Central and Eastern and Southern Europe, so not as widespread in places like France and England. And the books that I assign, the readings that students read, are usually about Eastern and Southern Europe. We look at it as like folklore, so I suppose it's relatively widespread. That's not the point of reading about vampires. One of the biggest challenges that I have teaching this class is getting students to to historicize all of these phenomena that seem like they're always around, you know? So why specifically do people in this particular time and place have this particular fear? Vampires is one of them, sort of this fear of vampires. What does this tell us about people living in Southern Europe in the early 1700s, for example? Another good example is this fear of being buried alive. And in the class, we do a whole week about the fear of being buried alive, which becomes really prevalent in the early 19th century. And we see people sort of designing all of these bizarre coffins with little like bells that you're supposed to ring if you've accidentally been buried alive. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon, and students can relate to that. Nobody wants to be buried alive. But so like the challenge there in that week is, well, why now? Why the early 19th century? What's happening in Europe that makes this kind of thing particularly fearful to people? Looking at ways that the living think about the dead and interact with the dead and handle the dead and dispose of the dead. It's a really good sort of way into bigger cultural transitions and bigger cultural problems and anxieties. I mean, we look at phenomena like secularization, revolution. We look at the development of like human rights theory, for example. We have a whole week where students look at the idea that the death penalty should be abolished. And so all of these little case studies about the way the living are thinking about the dead tell us something really important about that particular moment in history at that time and place.